All right, well, hi everyone. Welcome to this webinar on how to handle imposter syndrome. And I'm going to let Jaclyn take it away.
Great, thanks, Sydney. So hi everyone, thank you so much for coming today. I wanted to start by thanking Merle and everybody at SURE for inviting me to come back to talk about one of my favorite topics. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. But I want to start by acknowledging the land where we gather. I am a settler Canadian who was born on Treaty 4 territory and is now thankful to learn, live, and work on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree people and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I give my respect to the First Nation and Métis of this place as we move forward together into the future. So here's our plan for today. I'm going to start talking about my personal experiences. Then I will dive into some of the vast body of research on imposter syndrome, offer some possible strategies, and leave lots of time for us to have a conversation. So before we dive in, I'm wondering if you feel comfortable, could everyone throw an emoji into the chat about how you're feeling before we get started? Don't think about it too hard and don't feel obligated if you don't want to. I just think this is kind of a cool way to think about, to look at how perspectives change over time. So if you're able to just throw an emoji into the chat. I don't think we can do GIFs or memes, but it might be an interesting way to kind of see where we're at to start. But of course, no obligation. Yeah, definitely some shared feelings and thoughts here among attendees. And feel free to continue to react with emojis. One of the strangest things about presenting in this way is that I don't get any reactions back from you while I present. And it's not like I'm a comedian, there are no real jokes or anything. It's just nice to have a bit of interaction. So if I hit a point that you really like or that you have questions about, it could also help direct some of the conversation at the end. So we'll start with who I am. So my name is Jaclyn McLean. I'm the electronic resources librarian here at the university. I'm also a practitioner researcher. So I'm a faculty member who does research as a librarian who's practicing in a professional capacity. And a lot of my research has to do with my work, with the kinds of projects I'm looking at, with learning I can do to improve my own practice, and that I can share with other practitioners to hopefully, continue a conversation about improving practice and updating processes or new concepts or ideas. I'm also a tea drinker, a knitter, a cat owner, and sometimes I'm an imposter. So my interest in imposter syndrome was formalized when I was appointed as a tenure track librarian in 2015, who was all of a sudden expected to do research. Well, research, what could I research that would matter, right? I took one research methods class in my master's program, and I have not taken a real math class since high school, which was a few years ago. To me, when I thought about research, I thought about things like curing cancer, developing mathematical algorithms to look into black holes, or understanding human impacts of climate change, big things like that. So, when I was a student, I did research when it meant just reading a lot of things that other smart people had said and putting them together, right, to gather the existing knowledge into one place. But surely that couldn't be enough now that I was a faculty member myself. So I started wondering, where did these feelings come from and why did they make me feel so alone? So if you talked to me around that time in 2015, you would have heard me say things like, when will I be a real researcher? What will make me feel like I'm actually a researcher? Acceptance of my own value in that role really began when I had a conversation with a very smart woman that I work with, who told me that research is really just asking a question and then looking for the answer. It's that simple. It doesn't have to be those big things like curing cancer. So the question I started with was, why don't I feel like a real researcher? What makes me feel like a fraud? And that led me to looking into imposter syndrome. So it's exactly, Sydney. It's variously imposter, and then syndrome, phenomenon, and experience. All of these words in this little word salad tend to get thrown together in the research or when people talk about this particular thing. I mostly use imposter syndrome because that's what I still see being used mostly, but imposter phenomenon is actually what it was first called in 1978 by the psychologists who first identified it. So Clance and Immis were clinical psychologists, and they identified it as the psychological pattern of behavior where people persistently believe that they are unworthy of success, and that they are frauds who have managed to deceive everyone around them despite evidence to the contrary. Clance and Immis initially focused their research on high-achieving women, but a gender difference has been disproved in more recent research. So Clance talks a lot in those foundational research studies about experiencing imposter syndrome herself in grad school, when she would experience the feelings before writing an exam, and she would focus only on her fear of failing. And then after the exam, she would focus on all of the things she didn't know rather than the things that she did. And so obviously she must be incompetent. So as you might have guessed, or if you've ever looked into this, you will see there is a lot of research out there on imposter syndrome. A lot of it does focus on certain populations. That tends to be what a lot of the studies are. You know, how does imposter syndrome manifest in med students, in dental students, in first-generation students, in different flavors of academics, in women, in men, in leaders, in librarians, in scientists? If you can name a group of people or a profession, and someone has probably done a study on how imposter syndrome affects them, which is kind of nice. There's all of these different studies, but they tend to all support a fairly consistent definition of the features of imposter syndrome, which I'm going to outline now. Okay, so negative thinking, self-doubt, self-sabotaging your own success, and feelings of low self-esteem and lack of confidence are really common. But I also want to add a caveat here. These can also be present, these types of feelings can be present when someone is depressed or anxious. So if any of these types of feelings persist, please talk to a trusted professional for advice. Imposter syndrome is not in the DSM. It is not a diagnosable psychological condition, but it can accompany things that are real medical issues that should be talked about with a health professional. The second feature is that a common belief that you have fooled others into overestimating your abilities and being afraid that you won't live up to expectations and will be exposed as a fraud. Another is attributing any success to external factors other than your own ability or intelligence. So things like luck, extra work, your charisma, or your evaluator's misjudgment. For example, like, well, I never would have been hired if that other person didn't happen to retire the year I happened to graduate. Or, you know, the thesis advisor never would have taken me on if someone else hadn't dropped out last year. It's also common to worry about being exposed as an imposter, or that you won't live up to the expectations that others or yourself are setting. So we also build obstacles for ourselves as a feature of imposter syndrome. Common ones tend to include a fear of success, sabotaging your own success so that you won't fail. Overachieving or striving obsessively for perfection also go along with imposter syndrome. It can also cause people to second guess their own work, to hesitate to stand up for themselves or share their own opinions, and to also set very challenging goals and then be disappointed when they fall short. And the negative effects of these kinds of behaviors should be clear. When you're trying not to be exposed as a fake, or what you think you are, a fake, you work harder than you need to, and you may also avoid talking about these feelings and feel alone because you don't want to be exposed. So, if you are here today, I am here to tell you that you are not alone. If you have ever felt anything like this ever, research indicates overall from all of these studies over the last 50 years that over 70% of people tend to experience some of these things, these characteristics of imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. So those who don't are actually in the minority. So that's what imposter syndrome is. I'm sorry, my papers are out of order. Okay, so these feelings of inadequacy that persist, even in the face of information that says the opposite, these nagging feelings of self-doubt and intellectual fraudulence are common. They are not rare. When I have these feelings and these doubts, I name them. That's one of the strategies I'll talk about in a moment, but I call mine gremlins. And they take full advantage of all of your deepest doubts and fears and build an internal narrative about failure or being less than. And that's the internal monologue that builds. Oops. I'm going to turn that off. Okay. The person or yourself or myself will feel like they fooled everyone into believing that they're competent and that all their success feels undeserved and is dismissed. I'll mention here that imposter feelings tend to be primarily career-based and achievement-driven. So for students, that would be related to your schoolwork as you strive towards a career. People tend to feel unable to own their own accomplishments or see their own value, despite evidence to the contrary, and it can lead to overwork, setting those higher and higher unattainable goals, and eventually burnout. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some strategies. So aside from digging deeper into the research, and like I said, there's a huge body of research on imposter syndrome and what it feels like or what characterizes it, one of the things that I am most interested in is how people reduce the dissonance between their inner gremlins and the result of their work. So some of these strategies are things I have tried. They all come from the research. And some of them I have tried and they didn't work for me, but I know they've worked for other people. So I'm leaving them in. Feel free to pick and choose. Not all of these will feel appropriate for you or work for you. I'm just offering them here today as suggestions and hoping that we can talk more about this as we move into the discussion part of the session today. So the first strategy is to acknowledge the elephant in the room, to really identify and acknowledge what you're feeling. It matters. Learn to recognize the types of situations where you feel most like an imposter. Once you've learned to recognize and identify those feelings of imposter syndrome, the next step is to find a way to remind yourself and to build evidence that you are an amazing, unique individual. One of the ways that I do this is I have a folder in my email that's called When I Need a Boost. You can call your file whatever makes sense to you. I have a colleague who actually prints out any of the positive feedback they receive and they keep it in a physical file folder on their desk. So they have a real hard copy validation file rather than this digital version. But find a way to organize and take in all of the positive feedback you can get. Remind yourself regularly of the value of your work. One of the things that I do is when someone tweets at me something that gives me the warm fuzzies, I actually will screenshot that tweet and email it to myself so I can keep it in that same email folder. Because anyone who's on Twitter, you can like tweets, hundreds and thousands of them, and you'll never ever find that tweet again. So I like to screenshot it when it screenshot it when it happens, and then keep it in my email so I have all of my ideas in one place. And I can go back to it when I'm having a hard day. My next tip is that remember that failure, it does not have to be a catastrophe. Being wrong or making mistakes does not make you a fake or a failure. One thing to remember is that even the best basketball players, or insert sport here, they miss most of the shots they take, right? And they're still really successful athletes. Imperfection or failure does not create a disaster in most cases. This is one of the things I routinely remind myself and people I work with. You know, we're running a library. We are not performing brain surgery. And thank goodness I'm much more suited to working in a library than anything in healthcare. My next tip is to talk about it. That's something that I'm doing here today. And it's something that I recommend doing whenever you're having these feelings. To find a person or a group of people who you can talk to about how you're feeling. The key is that this person or these people need to be honest with you. They can't just be yes people and tell you you're fantastic all the time, which like they should, because you probably are. But it's also important that you're able to talk to these people when you're not feeling your strongest or your smartest or your best, and you can honestly talk through those feelings and have someone else understand them. Acknowledge that feeling incompetent and being incompetent are two different things. This also helps you know that you're not alone. Like we said, the majority of people have these feelings at some point in their life. Some of us have them for a long time. So talking about it with other people really helps reinforce that you are not alone on this journey. And it's extremely rewarding. It's one of my favorite tips. The next one is to build a new perspective. Your success, one way to think about it is to think about it like a painting by Monet. Up close, it looks like a bunch of wild brush strokes and blotches and splashes of paint that just don't make any sense. But from a distance, you see the true beauty and the value. So don't think about your success as from up close. Think about it in the context of all the things that you have done that worked well. Don't think about it in the context of all the things you haven't done yet or things that didn't work out, but try to put them into the context of the other things that have worked in the past, and celebrate each one and value it. Another thing you can do is find a mantra or a positivity statement that can help refocus you when the feelings of inadequacy get too big, or find something that'll just get you out of your head when those gremlins will not stop. One of the things that I do is I look on YouTube for videos of baby sweaters or baby goats in sweaters and pajamas, because when baby goats are sometimes really little, they have to put them in clothes because they're not big enough to stay warm. And then they dance and jump wearing clothes. It's adorable. And recently I have been revisiting a TikTok video of Harry Styles dancing to Taylor Swift, which never fails to take me out of whatever funk I'm in and just let me give my head a shake. So rather than focusing on the negative, like the answers you don't get on the exam, try to focus on the positive and flip the narrative. You know, looking outside today, the weather might be cool and it's going to rain. It's kind of maybe looking rainy for the long weekend, but isn't it wonderful how green everything looks? And we definitely need some rain and moisture in this province. You know, the flowers are going to bloom and they're going to smell so great, and the leaves are coming out, and the rain is what's helping all of that happen. So part of this can also be about looking at mistakes or things that don't go right as opportunities for learning rather than as failures, and trying not to dwell on the things that don't work out, but instead shift your focus to the things that did work or are working. So redirect your attention, use your mantra, and focus on the things that are working well. The other thing that helps me to remind myself is that it's good to care. That you can find strength in your commitment or your belief in your work. If you didn't care, you actually wouldn't feel so strongly, and you wouldn't worry so much about being a fraud or looking like a fraud. And this can be good to remember because sometimes caring feels really frustrating. And it's important to remember that you can't feel like an imposter if you don't care. Caring is a strength. However, I can tell you that finding the balance between caring and wanting perfection, or caring so deeply that you can't let it go, is really challenging. And so if anyone has any solution on that, I hope we'll talk about it in a few minutes here, because I do not have that solution yet. I'm good at the caring, not great at the letting go. Next, make sure you reward yourself. Celebrate your successes and acknowledge your strengths. Consciously do this every time something you work hard on turns out well. Take a minute to pause. Learn to take a compliment for your work. Instead of, oh, no, it was nothing, or, attributing it to luck or external factors, learn to say thank you and internalize compliments when you receive them. Celebrating your success might look something like, visiting friends and having a delicious snack. It might look like a quiet evening with no studying, a moment walking in the garden to smell the flowers, an hour spent stargazing or staring into space, doing absolutely nothing, a warm cup of tea on a cool night. It might look like giving yourself a pep talk in the hall before your next class or meeting about how well that last thing just went. One of the ways I'm celebrating the milestone of completing this presentation and giving it today is I'm going to go pick up my holds that are waiting at the library so I can spend some quality time reading this weekend. The next strategy is to write it down. Identify the thoughts that are happening. Let them come. Sit down and write down your biggest fears, the most ridiculous things that are coming through your mind. Don't censor yourself. Write it out. Stream of consciousness. Externalizing those thoughts can give you perspective, and sometimes seeing those thoughts in writing will lessen their power. So make a list of your feelings and work on them. Break down tasks that seem monumental into bite-sized things that feel achievable. One of the favorite pieces of advice that I give to people when they're talking to me about being overwhelmed is I ask the fairly cliche question of, well, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. The same way you have to approach difficult projects or, hard moments in your life. One of the other things you can do when you're writing it down is add a supernatural or just an absolutely out of left field element to your stream of consciousness writing. So you can, if you're worried that no one's going to fill in your survey, or only trolls will, well, imagine those trolls with little jeweled belly buttons and the sticking up neon hair. Or you're worried that your final exam is going to be interrupted by something and you'll lose your focus. Well, imagine that something is a velociraptor. And it will help you get out of your head, kind of shift that perspective, but also to acknowledge that while those fears and worries are valid and real, finding a way to make them feel less paralyzing can be really helpful. And my last tip is maybe not super helpful, but I think it's helpful sometimes. Sometimes you have to fake it till you make it. There is neuroplasticity research that smiling can make you feel happier. And I would say, I think it applies in the same way. Pretend that you've got it. Everyone else only sees you as the Monet painting from a few feet away, right? They don't hear your inner monologue. They don't know your gremlins. So projecting that confidence can sometimes help you feel more confident. Remind yourself that all of those feelings of doubt and overwhelm are inside. You share them with your trusted group and you share them with each other. But that means that maybe in a professional setting or a place where you're not able to do that kind of sharing, you can project confidence and expertise until it feels more comfortable and like it fits a little better. You can also think about this as visualizing success, even though you maybe don't feel for sure that you'll be successful on the inside. Courage comes from taking risks, and you'll build your courage the more risks that turn out as success. So here's a quick summary of the strategies I've offered. Like I said, you might immediately have liked some of them. You might have immediately thought, nope, it's not going to work for me. Totally fine. These are suggestions, like I said, based on things I found in the research and my own experience and things I've talked about with others. So there is a ton of advice. Just doing a search on the internet for imposter syndrome will bring you an overwhelming thousands and thousands numbers of results. So if you're looking for other types of advice, please go out and find it. And share it with people. So I can't talk about imposter syndrome without talking about how the narratives around it, things like grit and leaning in and hard work, can't eliminate the reality that it is a result of the systems and the organizations we are part of. The more that I read and I think about imposter syndrome and other topics, I'm coming around to the idea that it cannot be appreciated as an individual psychological mechanism, but instead, we need to also look at the social structures through which these mechanisms operate. I've been reading more research articles, especially from philosophy, about imposter syndrome lately. And one philosopher suggests that people who experience the imposter phenomenon are not necessarily irrational. They are often simply integrating their evidence as they should because it reflects their environment. So we shouldn't think of those people, and they shouldn't think of themselves as defective. There's also some very good research and commentary available about how imposter syndrome is a byproduct of systemic oppression. Oppression like racism, sexism, and ableism, which results in a system that fails certain individuals and is not a failure of those individuals. So providing comforting messages about imposter syndrome without addressing these roots feels disingenuous to me. We can't talk about, personal strategies for addressing something that is actually systemic and ignore the systemic causes. So another action that you can take is to examine complicity with the systems that encourage these structures and advocate for disruption to those systems. So Blair Imani, who I've quoted here on the slide, this is one of her Instagram posts. She offers a lot of teaching on this topic, both through her Instagram account and through paid things like Patreon. And I find her teaching really valuable, especially in this area. There's also a lot of pop culture discussion about imposter syndrome, which can be a little bit fun, and while acknowledging the systemic oppression that leads to feelings of imposters, sometimes having those conversations can be easier through the lens of something like pop culture. So I like to look at things like this as a reminder that at least 70% of people feel like an imposter some of the time, that we are actually the majority. And some of the research articles I read suggested that people who don't have those thoughts and feelings are the minority, and they're actually the strange ones. So maybe that's also comforting. A couple of tweets here that I'll share. A quick sip of tea while you read. This is one of my favorite things. When my gremlins get really loud, I remind myself that I am a trickster goddess, which is what a great reframing, right? I also really like this quote from Tina Fey. I think it has also helped me to think about the fact that imposter syndrome tends to be associated with people who are high achievers, who are successful and passionate, and they bring those feelings to their work. And it's about the fear of failing bubbling up. That it's not always about low self-esteem, but it's about being successful and not feeling deserving of that. As Tina Fey says, finding a way to ride that egomania. Albert Einstein also talked about being an imposter, but as he passed away 20 years before this theory was written, he talked about being an involuntary swindler, which I think is also a great way to frame this. And he said this later in his life. You know, he developed most of his major theories when he was very young, and his later career might have seemed less successful in context. So it's interesting to think about historical people who we still highly respect and venerate, 70 years after they passed away, also had these same thoughts and feelings. So here's my bottom line. Hopefully this is helpful for others. So people who feel like imposters when they aren't are actually passionate about their work or wherever those feelings are coming up, and they care about the outcome. It can be a sign of strength and that you're good at keeping perspective on your own abilities. Just don't let it take over and lead you down the road to burnout or overwhelm you and let those fears overtake the successes. And try to keep perspective on when and where you feel it and question the systems that are at work in those times and places. Remember that imposter syndrome does not act alone. It happens in the context of everything else we deal with in this post-industrialist, capitalist, patriarchal world we live in every day. I would recommend the book Burnout by Emily and Amelia Nagoski to everyone, because it is essential for understanding stress cycles, which are tied to imposter syndrome in my mind, and also burnout, and about existing in this world we currently live in. It's evidence-based, but they also bring some humor to it. It's an easier piece of nonfiction to digest. So feelings of being an imposter may never go away completely, and maybe that's a good thing. I was talking about this presentation today with a colleague yesterday because we were chatting about something else, and I said, oh, I'm putting this presentation together for sure for tomorrow. And I just had lunch with her, and she told me that she was up with terrible dreams about being an imposter, and that our conversation had brought that up, that in her dream she had shown up at a conference where she wasn't just to give a talk, but to provide a multi-day workshop, and she hadn't prepared. And she's a senior colleague who has been working for a long time. So these feelings may never go away, and that's okay. Staying aware for myself, I stay aware of what it feels like for me. I learn to recognize the signs and recognize the voices of my gremlins. And I look at that as a sign that I'm learning and growing. So I use my strategies and I keep learning more of them. I continue to go back and revisit the research and dive into research from different disciplines, not just psychology, on imposter syndrome. And for me, I've really found that sharing vulnerability can be a strength. That sharing feelings of being an imposter with others is the way I have been able to identify and grow and not feel them as often. Now I find that I tend to experience imposter syndrome almost cyclically when I decide to try something new, when I'm learning something new that seems hard and I don't feel like I can do it. That's when I tend to have those feelings these days. But like I said, I'm getting better at identifying it and working through it and talking about it with others. And whenever I do that, I feel less alone, and I usually learn something valuable from whoever I talk to. So I'm going to wrap up the part where I just talk now. And thank you all for giving me your time today. I can't wait to talk about strategies, imposter syndrome, whatever else has bubbled up from this presentation in the time that's left. And thank you so much for inviting me into this experience that you're all sharing. I'd also encourage you to get in touch with me anytime. I work at the university library. I'm around. I can talk about this topic. I can connect you with someone who knows how to work the printers, or any other question you have about the library that you haven't been sure who to talk to. I know the right people, so I'm here. And I'm really interested in these kinds of conversations and looking forward to it. So before we get started, and maybe before they turn the recording off, if you have an emoji that you can throw into the chat and see if maybe they're maybe less worried looking than they were at the beginning, or perhaps more, which is great either way. So I will encourage you to toss an emoji in have a little sip of tea, and then we can move into the conversation part of today. These look great. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, Sydney, because I'm done with my slides.